February 20th, 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The needle on the fuel meter hung near empty as Colonel Hans-Georg Hildebrandt's command truck reached the top of the hill, looking over the deserted American supply post. The leader of the 21st Panzer Division put down his binoculars twice, sure that the morning sun was making illusions across the desert landscape. Spread before him were line after line of fuel barrels, piled up neatly in the American way, shining like treasure in the North African sunrise. Hildebrandt's division had been running on empty, carefully saving their last bit of fuel when they came across what the fleeing U.S. Second Corps had left behind in their escape through Kasserine Pass. The post held 57,000 gallons of fuel, more gas than his whole division usually got from Germany in 2 months. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. And if stories of heroes appearing in the darkest hour thrill you, then hit subscribe, because we're just getting started. Major Friedrich von Mellenthin, an intelligence officer for the Afrika Korps, would later write in his life story, "We found more gas in one American storage area than most German divisions had seen since El Alamein. The Americans ran and left enough fuel to run our whole army for days. What kind of foe has so much that they can afford to leave it behind?" This moment at Kasserine Pass showed a truth more crushing than any battlefield loss. The Americans had material riches so huge that their left-behind supplies were more than the Wehrmacht could manage to send across the Mediterranean. The 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions had just won Germany's biggest battlefield victory against American troops in North Africa, taking materials that for a time changed their ability to operate. Yet inside that win was the mathematical proof of a certain defeat. The rules of modern war were being written not in skill or bravery, but in fuel used versus fuel received. And those numbers told a tale that no amount of German battlefield skill could change. By February 1943, the Afrika Korps had perfected desert fighting through 2 years of battles that had made them famous. Under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's direction, they had pushed the British back to Egypt, gained Montgomery's respect, and made the North African front a display of German fighting greatness. Yet every win now was weighed against a more and more desperate math problem: fuel needed versus fuel on hand. Wehrmacht supply records from late 1942 showed the emergency in harsh detail. The German-Italian forces in North Africa needed 32,250 tons of supplies each month for their 65,000 men, with fuel by itself making up 1,700 tons, or 54% of all needs. But Mediterranean shipping groups faced destructive attacks. Malta-based planes and submarines were sinking 60 to 70% of Axis supply ships by early 1943. What got to African ports then had a 2,500-kilometer trip to the front, using more fuel than it carried. The desert's hunger for fuel was more than all European estimates. A single panzer division needed 350 tons of supplies every day during fighting. Moving 1 ton of supplies to the front lines used 5 tons of fuel in travel alone. Tank teams had become pros at saving fuel in ways that would have seemed silly in Poland or France, like coasting down hills with engines off, push-starting trucks to save batteries, and taking fuel from damaged vehicles with near-religious care. Rommel himself had said in January 1943, "Our actions are decided more by the gas meter than by battle needs." This was not an exaggeration. It was a mathematical fact. The Afrika Korps had only 3 days of fuel left at El Alamein when Montgomery launched his attack. By February, even though they were closer to supply ports, things had gotten worse. At dawn on February 14, 1943, Field Marshal Rommel and General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim started their joint attack against American troops holding spots in central Tunisia. Operation Spring Wind sent General Friedrich von Broick's 10th Panzer Division and Colonel Hildebrandt's 21st Panzer through the Fide Pass toward Sidi Bouzid. This was the Afrika Korps' last big armored attack, a frantic try to mess up Allied plans before their material advantage became too great. The attack caught them completely by surprise. More than 100 German tanks and assault guns, with help from armored infantry, hit positions held by the U.S. 1st Armored Division's Combat Command A. The Americans, set up in separate spots on hilltops, couldn't help each other. Their M3 Grant and Lee tanks, with their tall shapes and body-mounted main guns, were terribly exposed to German combined arms methods, perfected over 3 years of fighting. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, leading the 1st Battalion, 1st Armored Regiment, lost 44 of his 51 tanks in the first fight at Sidi Bouzid. The destruction was methodical. German experienced soldiers carried out perfect moves while American teams, many fighting for the first time, charged one by one into focused fire. Yet even in their win, fuel was the main thing on German minds. Panzer IV companies had to leave behind working vehicles just because their tanks ran out of gas. The irony was sharp, destroying enemy troops they couldn't chase, winning fights they couldn't take advantage of, all because the fuel meter said empty. On February 17, 1943, as American troops fell back toward Kasserine Pass, they left behind supply posts set up according to U.S. Army rules that seemed like a fantasy to German supply chiefs. American plans called for one post every 50 to 100 miles, each with extra supplies enough to keep fighting even if others were lost. German troops, who measured fuel by the liter and counted every artillery shell, found more than they could imagine. A scout patrol from the 21st Panzer Division found the first big post near Spitla. The patrol leader's report, saved in Wehrmacht files, gives a look into the German shock. The post covered about 25 acres. Fuel barrels were piled in perfect lines, over 400 barrels of 55 gallons each. There were meals for what must have been a whole regiment for a month. White bread, still fresh, canned meat, real coffee, chocolate, cigarettes by the 1,000 cartons. Medical supplies we haven't seen since 1941. German soldiers who had been living on Italian hard bread and substitute coffee made from acorns devoured the American meals with the hunger of starving men. The chocolate alone was more than German non-military people got in monthly amounts, but it was the fuel that was most important. Within hours, vehicles that were marked as not working because of empty tanks were suddenly running again. From February 19th to 20th, 1943, as German troops pushed through the 2-mile-wide Kasserine Pass, they overran the main American supply system that was helping the 2nd Corps. What they found was beyond their greatest hopes and their worst fears. The battle's material results were amazing. German forces took 183 tanks, 104 half-tracks, 208 artillery guns, 5 12 trucks and other vehicles, along with 57,000 gallons of gasoline and oils and 45 tons of ammunition. To understand this, the fuel alone was nearly a week's supply for the whole Afrika Korps, more than many German divisions had gotten in the last 3 months. Rommel himself looked at the captured posts on February 21st. His assistant, Helmuth von Leipzig, wrote down the field marshal's response. Rommel stood quiet for a long time, looking at the mountains of supplies. Then he said softly, "Each American battalion is supplied better than our whole divisions. What kind of win is it when the enemy can afford to lose more than we can afford to use?" The captured American trucks turned out to be even more useful than fuel in the near future. Wehrmacht records show that by February 1943, 85% of Rommel's transport was made up of captured British and American vehicles. The American 2.5-ton trucks, which German soldiers called Jimmies, were especially valued, more dependable than German Opel Blitz trucks, easier to fix, and left behind with spare parts that German forces had not seen in years. The captured goods showed more than material riches. They uncovered completely different ways of making war. American military thinking, as Germans found out from captured field books, counted on massive oversupply as a safety measure. Where German divisions worked on 200 tons of supplies a day, American divisions were given 700 tons, a difference that showed not just riches, but a completely different idea of war. Questioning of captured Americans brought more shocks. Captain William Baker of the 1st Armored Division said his battalion usually got 100% of asked-for supplies, plus a 25% extra amount. When German intelligence officers said this was propaganda, Baker laughed and said that was seen as the lowest acceptable level. Captured order forms proved they were given amounts that were more than entire German monthly deliveries. General Friedrich von Broich, leading the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in his after-battle report, "The enemy works on ideas strange to our knowledge. They expect waste, plan for extra, and see backup as vital. This is not an army in the European way. It is a factory process that also includes fighting. The German win at Kasserine created a puzzle that even new officers saw. The captured supplies for a time fixed immediate needs, allowing for actions that would have otherwise been impossible. Yet the huge amount showed the mathematical impossibility of a final win. The effect on the minds of German soldiers was deep. They found medical supplies including penicillin, a wonder drug not available even in German army hospitals. They found chocolate and coffee as normal meals while their families in Germany lived on turnips and substitute foods. Most disheartening were the captured papers showing these materials would be replaced within weeks. Shipping lists showed this was just one of dozens of similar posts. A young officer of the 10th Panzer Division wrote home in a letter that was saved in family records, "We feast on American meals while our families starve. We burn American fuel while our home country has shortages. We have won a battle by taking what our enemies throw away. This is not a win. It is picking up scraps." Field Marshal Rommel had a total change in his view of American forces after Kasserine. At first, he dismissed them, calling them badly trained and equipped with poor methods. But after seeing their material resources, Rommel saw that fighting skill mattered less than factory power. In his February 22nd report to the German High Command, partly quoted in Histories After the War, Rommel wrote, "The Americans are militarily new, but materially overpowering. They learn from mistakes we cannot afford to make. Time is completely on their side. Each day they get stronger while we get weaker, no matter the battle results." His final judgment turned out to be true. We can win battles but not the war. The Americans bring to the battlefield not better tactics but better numbers. They win through the multiplication of supplies, gear, and tries. We are fighting the entire factory output of America. After Kasserine, the Afrika Korps ran more and more on captured supplies. This reliance created a downward spiral. Every move forward needed them to capture enemy goods, changing battle planning into frantic scavenging trips. By March 1943, Wehrmacht records showed strange mixes of gear. German teams using captured Sherman tanks marked with German crosses, artillery groups firing American 105mm howitzers, transport companies running only on captured trucks. The proud Afrika Korps had changed into what one veteran later called a parasite army, living off the enemy's excess. The reliance reached ridiculous levels. German repair shops used American tools and spare parts. Medical teams depended completely on captured American supplies. Even staff cars ran on American fuel as German amounts were saved for combat vehicles that were more and more scarce. The captured papers at Kasserine gave German intelligence its first true picture of American production. What they found was beyond understanding. A single captured report from the Detroit Tank Arsenal showed the production of 1,350 M4 Sherman tanks in January 1943 alone, more than the total German tank production for that 3-month period. More crushing were the production trends. American output was going up every month while German production was going down because of bombing and lack of resources. The numbers were simple and cruel. America made 4,000 planes a month. Germany made 2,000. America made 4,000 tanks a month. Germany made 500. America made 50,000 vehicles a month. Germany made 5,000. Major Hermann Kohl, a factory engineer with the Afrika Korps, studied the captured papers and wrote in a report that was hidden, "We are not fighting an army. We are fighting an entire continent's factory output. The result is decided by production numbers, not battlefield bravery. Beyond the material numbers were human numbers that were just as impossible. The Afrika Korps was losing experienced soldiers who couldn't be replaced, while Americans came with new training and endless gear. Each destroyed German tank meant a crew was lost that took years to train. Each American loss was replaced in weeks. An intercepted American message showed they were shipping replacement crews at a rate of 5,000 a month to North Africa. The Afrika Korps hadn't gotten 5,000 total replacements since El Alamein. The math of losses was as cruel as the math of supply. The mix of captured gear created a repair nightmare that sped up the German defeat. American vehicles needed parts that German shops couldn't make. Captured tanks needed special tools that German crews didn't have. The great amount of captured gear became a problem as mechanical breakdowns destroyed what fighting had not. By April 1943, left-behind American vehicles were all over German positions, not destroyed in battle but stopped by a lack of repair. The Afrika Korps had taken more than it could keep up, a symbol for their whole North African fight. General von Arnim, who took over command in Tunisia after Rommel left because of sickness, was left with an impossible problem. His troops were working mainly on captured materials they couldn't replace, relying on supply lines that brought almost nothing while using up precious fuel. His chief of staff's view was direct. We are fighting with borrowed time and stolen supplies against an enemy with unlimited amounts of both. Numbers, not tactics, decide the outcome. We can win every battle and still lose through numbers alone. As German troops fell back into a smaller and smaller area around Tunis and Bizerte, their reliance on captured supplies became total. Units ran entirely on seized American materials, making the strange situation of the Wehrmacht fighting with American gear against American troops. The final German staff report from April 1943 showed the impossible math. They needed 7,500 tons of supplies a month for defensive fighting. They were getting less than 1,000 tons. American forces were getting 15,000 tons every day. The ratio of supply advantage was more than 450 to 1. On May 13, 1943, the Afrika Korps gave up, along with all other Axis forces in North Africa. Over 275,000 German and Italian soldiers became prisoners. They gave up not to better generals or braver soldiers, but to the unstoppable numbers of industrial war. Years later, living Afrika Korps veterans would meet for reunions where they thought about what Kasserine meant. Their stories, written down by historians, give the final view of what the captured supplies truly meant. Friedrich Schultz, who led a panzer company, said in 1985, "We thought we won at Kasserine because we took the pass and the supplies. We actually lost because those supplies showed us the war was already over. When your biggest win involves taking what your enemy leaves behind, you are not winning. You are putting off defeat." Wilhelm Hoffmann, a supply officer with the 21st Panzer, remembered in 1990, "The American fuel we captured meant everything for our tactics and nothing for our strategy. It let us keep fighting for a few more weeks, but it also showed that our enemies measured fuel in ship loads while we measured it in barrels. We were fighting against endlessness with limited resources." The importance of Kasserine Pass was not in the battle moves that historians argue about, but in the simple numbers shown by the captured goods. German monthly fuel amount, 12,000 gallons when it arrived. American fuel taken at Kasserine, 57,000 gallons. American monthly fuel shipments to North Africa, 15 million gallons. Time for America to replace Kasserine losses, 2 weeks. Time for Germany to gather similar supplies, 6 months, if not stopped. These numbers told a story that no amount of brilliant fighting could change. The Afrika Korps got its biggest battlefield win at the very moment it found out that strategic loss was certain. For Americans, Kasserine Pass was a hard lesson in fighting that led to fast improvement. They replaced poor leaders, improved tactics, and better organized their massive material advantages. Within weeks, they had turned a loss into a chance to learn. For Germans, Kasserine was a reveal of the impossible. They had won on the battlefield while finding out they had already lost the bigger war. The supplies they took, those 57,000 gallons of fuel, those 183 tanks, those mountains of food and ammunition, gave short-term help while proving that a final win was a mathematical certainty. Major Friedrich von Mellenthin, who was an intelligence officer for the whole campaign, wrote in his post-war life story, Panzer Battles, "At Kasserine, we learned that the Americans could afford to lose a battle. We could not afford to win one. They replaced their losses in weeks. We couldn't replace our wins. This was not war as we knew it. It was factory numbers in army clothes." The deeper truth shown at Kasserine was that World War II had become a competition of factory power rather than military talent. The Wehrmacht, built by European fights where battle skill could beat material disadvantage, found in North Africa that factory output decided results more than brilliant tactics. The captured American goods pointed to a production system working on ideas that German planners had not thought of. Where Germany looked for efficiency, America aimed for backup. Where Germany saved, America expected waste. Where Germany figured out minimum needs, America multiplied everything by amounts that seemed crazy to Germans used to having little. An American supply book taken at Kasserine laid out ammunition use that was more than entire German battle allowances. Artillery groups were allowed to fire blanketing barrages using more shells than German units got for specific targets. The wastefulness seemed criminal to German officers who saved every single round. The effect on German morale turned out to be more harmful than material losses. Soldiers who had believed in German technical greatness found American gear that was not just plentiful, but often better. The Sherman tank, at first made fun of by German crews, was more dependable than German Panthers. American radios worked better than German communication gear. American meals were better than anything German soldiers had eaten since before the war. Letters home, those that got past censors and bombing, showed the depth of their lost spirit. Soldiers wrote of American chocolate bars that were better than German children's Christmas gifts. They described medical supplies that could have saved German wounded who died for lack of simple medicines. They talked about fuel waste that was more than German allowances. The propaganda office eventually stopped trying to talk about North African operations in a good way. Goebbels himself wrote that soldiers who had seen American plenty couldn't be persuaded Germany was winning through words alone. As the last area shrank around Tunis in early May 1943, German forces made a final check of their situation. They were working almost entirely on captured gear, burning captured fuel, firing captured ammunition. The Afrika Korps that had come to Africa as the Wehrmacht's best had become completely reliant on the enemy's generosity. The surrender on May 13, 1943, was almost a letdown. German forces had run out of fuel, ammunition, food, and hope. They gave up to an enemy who could afford to be kind in victory because victory had been guaranteed by factory production long before the last shot was fired. General Hans Kramer, the last leader of the Afrika Korps, said simply, "We were beaten by superior material." But this softened the truth. They were beaten by a system that could afford to lose what Germany couldn't afford to win, that could waste what Germany couldn't get, that could replace in days what Germany couldn't make in months. The Battle of Kasserine Pass went into American military history as a loss that taught important lessons about being ready for battle and coordinating tactics. Within weeks, the U.S. Army had changed, bringing in new leaders like George Patton and using hard-won lessons about focusing forces and combined arms fighting. But for the Germans who won the battle, Kasserine meant something much deeper. The moment when a battlefield win showed that the larger war was impossible to win. The supplies they took gave them the ability to keep fighting for a little while, but also proved that a long-term win was mathematically impossible. Veterans who survived being prisoners and came back to Germany after the war would often think of Kasserine as the moment they knew Germany would lose, not because of the battle situation, which was still good, but because of the factory numbers shown by those captured supplies. In 2003, on the 60th anniversary of Kasserine Pass, the last living German officer from the battle, a former lieutenant who wanted to stay unknown, gave this view. "We captured enough fuel to run for days, enough food to feast for weeks, enough ammunition to fight battles. But we also captured an understanding. The Americans could lose such amounts without worry. We couldn't get such amounts with our best tries. We were fighting against mathematical certainty that was dressed up as military actions. Those 57,000 gallons of fuel we took were both our rescue and our end. Rescue because they let us keep resisting, and because they proved resistance was pointless. We had seen a glimpse of American factory power, and we knew that no amount of German bravery could beat American numbers. Kasserine taught the Americans how to fight. It taught us that we had already lost. Both lessons were true, but ours was the final one. The Afrika Korps' capture of American supply areas at Kasserine Pass in February 1943 was the last major German battlefield win in North Africa. The 57,000 gallons of fuel, 183 tanks, 512 vehicles, and tons of supplies they took allowed them to keep on with actions that would have been otherwise impossible. Yet inside this battlefield, success was a strategic disaster. The captured supplies showed a difference in factory power so big that no amount of fighting skill could beat it. German forces had found they were fighting not the United States Army, but the United States itself, its factories, its farms, its endless ability for production and replacement. The numbers were cruel. While German forces celebrated taking 57,000 gallons of fuel, American forces were shipping millions of gallons a month to North Africa. While Germans carefully fixed captured Sherman tanks, America was making 1,350 a month. While German soldiers cherished captured American meals, American production could feed armies and still destroy extra to keep prices up. At Kasserine Pass, the Afrika Korps won a battle that proved the war was lost. They took supplies that showed they couldn't supply themselves. They had a battlefield win that showed strategic loss was certain. They found out that in modern industrial war, countries that could afford to leave behind 57,000 gallons of fuel would surely beat countries that couldn't afford to get. The memory of Kasserine Pass is therefore very different for the winner and the loser. For Americans, it was a tough lesson that led to quick improvement and, in the end, a great win. For Germans, it was a realization that bravery and skill meant nothing against industrial numbers. That battlefield greatness couldn't beat strategic impossibility. That they were fighting not armies but numbers, and numbers always win. In the end, those 57,000 gallons of captured American fuel told the whole story of World War II, not in battles won or lost, but in the factory power to fight a modern war. The Afrika Korps had captured proof of their own loss, taken evidence of the impossible, and won a victory that proved victory was impossible. They had found in deserted American supply areas in the Tunisian desert the mathematical certainty of the Third Reich's downfall.